When you're the manager of a team that massively underperforms 2 seasons in a row, no less, you're understandably going to take a lot of the criticism. But this year and the Giants falling short doesn't land on Bob Melvin, in my opinion, even though he thinks that it does.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015. I've been hosting this show for over 5 years, and I'm a lifelong Giants fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. So check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. This episode today is brought to you in part by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And where we get started is we're just going to jump right in to the this interview by Andrew Baggarly in The Athletic with Bob Melvin that I promised yesterday I would get more into. There was just so much more that I didn't have a chance to cover yesterday as we broke down mostly the little spat between Marco Luciano and Tyler Fitzgerald. So if you want an analysis of that, go check out yesterday's episode. But here, we're going to focus largely on this interview because it was wide-ranging and there were a lot of significant quotes. And basically, I want to start off with the topic of balancing analytics and instinct. And this is a big thing for major league managers to do. Like, this is probably one of the most challenging things that managers have to do, especially a manager who's been around a while like Bob Melvin. And he says, I'm not even going to read the question because it kind of is irrelevant in this particular case, but he said, you know, because he managed the A's for a long time, obviously, then he went to San Diego and then he came here. And he says, Oakland was very analytic based. San Diego was not. And maybe, at least in the second year with the Padres, I didn't push the running game and bunting and some of the traditional stuff that maybe I'd done in Arizona. So he's going way back to his time in Arizona. Maybe I didn't do it enough in Oakland either, but it worked for our model there. And coming to San Francisco, I learned from San Diego that you have to be able to do some stuff like that. And maybe here, again, the Giants were more analytic based. So maybe I got caught in the middle a little bit with what my feelings were and how to do things as opposed to what the right thing might be to do in a particular organization given what the model was. So that is a complex answer, and I appreciate his thoughts and the thoughtfulness that goes into this answer here. And Baggarly follows up with a good question. He says, it sounds like you're describing situations when you'd make a game level decision and not feel totally all in on it. And Melvin says, correct. And I'm not blaming it on anything or anyone else. It's on me. If there's a move that all the numbers say is the right thing to do, but your gut is telling you maybe not today, and you still make that, and then Baggarly says, analytics driven, and then Melvin continues, move, that's when you really kick yourself later. And so, of course, this is subject to like hindsight bias, right? If it doesn't work out, you're going to kick yourself kind of no matter what. And it's confirmation bias. Like if it doesn't work out, it's like I should have trusted my gut. If it does work out, you're like, oh yeah, that's why I trusted the model or whatever. And so, you know, it's interesting to hear him talk about Oakland analytic based, San Diego not. And that I pointed this out yesterday, but, you know, as I mentioned in the open there, two disappointing seasons in a row, like high profile teams. The Giants had a big offseason this past offseason. The Padres had a loaded roster in 2023, and both teams have underperformed, and the Giants are almost certainly not going to the playoffs. The Padres didn't last year either, with a team with Tatis and Juan Soto and Manny Machado and on and on. And I don't know him but I wanted to point out it's easy to forget he was there 2 years with San Diego, and in the first year they won, I think it was 89 games, and they went to the National League Championship Series and were just a couple wins away from going to the World Series. So it's kind of like people don't talk about that part, and that was in year one there. And so it's interesting to hear him say, like, in year two in San Diego, because if you look at it in San Diego, what went wrong in year two is mostly, and I talked to Javier Reyes from Locked On Padres about this a lot, that it kind of just boils down to they did extremely poorly in one-run games and in extra inning games. And you might say that falls on the manager, like, oh, a close game going against you is an indictment on the manager's ability to kind of win close games, right? Or like make the right bullpen decisions or whatever. But then my counter argument to that, which I think is kind of a very good one, is that the Giants this year, I tend to think, like in most cases, teams are going to be right in the middle. Like that's what we should kind of expect when it comes to one-run games, extra inning games, unless you're like horrible as a team. But like the Rockies stink, and they're 7-4 in one-run games, and they're actually 24-19 in one-run games. And the Dodgers are 18-17 in one-run games, right? So that just is a perfect indication that it's kind of, those are coin flip type of scenarios. And it just, when you have a year where it's extreme in one direction or the other, that it's not so much like something to read into too much. And so, yeah, Melvin and the Padres last year were really bad in extra inning games and one-run games. But Melvin and the Giants this year, they're 22-22 in one-run games, and they're 7-8 in extra inning games. So they couldn't be more in the middle. It would be impossible to be 500 in extra inning games given they've played an odd number of them. But if they have another extra inning game and they win it, it'll be, potentially 8-8 in extra inning games. And so it's not that there's no common thread here that, oh, he just can't win one-run games. They were perfectly average in one-run games this year after being like kind of historically bad in one-run games last year. And go figure, the Padres this year are 8-1 in extra innings, whereas last year I think it took them till September to win an extra inning game. And it happened to come against the Giants, by the way, that first extra inning win. And yeah, I mean, just looking through the league, there are plenty of good teams who have bad records in one-run games. Like the Astros are bad in extra innings and one-run games. There's just countless examples. It's not even worth, like the Yankees are 4-8 in extra innings and below 500 in one-run games. And so it's all just kind of irrelevant to me. And so that's just what I want to say about that. But for Melvin, talking about how he struggled with kind of whether or not he was making the right decision and feeling like he was caught in the middle, I wonder exactly which situations he's referring to. I do think back recently to that White Sox game where they were going for the sweep and they went with like Spencer Bivens in the ninth inning with the bases loaded and 2 outs and a tie game. And maybe that's like, for whatever reason, their matchup / analytics numbers said that was a good matchup for him. And he did it and it didn't work. And then it's like you're kicking yourself and saying, I should have gone to whoever else, or not starting the inning with Eric Miller and instead starting it with like a Taylor Rogers, whatever the case may be. So I just thought that was really interesting. And the next kind of category of question that I want to get into is about regrets and strategy adjustments moving forward. So we'll get to the questions from Baggarly and Melvin's very insightful answers coming up in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by Game Time. I love going to baseball games in the summer, and I've had a great time this year traveling on the road to watch the Giants. I went to San Diego, LA, Boston, Denver, and there still may be another trip on the horizon this September. And Game Time has made the ticket buying experience just way better and easier than ever before for me. Some of the things I love are Game Time picks. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. All-in pricing. If you toggle this feature, it shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views. You get panoramic views from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee. Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you find tickets in the same section and row for less. And Game Time ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, here we go. We are going to continue looking at this interview in The Athletic with Bob Melvin speaking with Andrew Baggarly, and it's a really good interview and worth a full read if you have a subscription. There is a subscription required to access this interview, but we are breaking it down here on Locked On Giants. And thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Everydayers, tomorrow we'll be breaking down game 1 of this series between the Giants and the Brewers. Landon Roop is going to make the start for the Giants, and they're going up against Aaron Savali, who kind of dominated them in his last outing, and yet he's had a rough year. So hopefully the Giants can turn the tide. I think when we're talking realistic goals for the Giants for the rest of the season, one of them would just be to get over 500. And they're only 2 games under right now. So it's a realistic-ish goal. And so, yeah, I'm all about those realistic goals. And we'll be breaking down this home series against the Brewers tomorrow. For your second listen, check out the Locked On MLB podcast. Host Paul Sullivan, a.k.a. Sully, is here daily to provide national expertise with his trademark humor to help you get ready for the MLB playoffs here in the dog days of summer. Prepare for the Fall Classic with Sully, who has it all covered every single day on Locked On MLB, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And a reminder that you can catch every pitch of the Giants' hometown broadcast with SiriusXM. Just download the SXM app and search the word Giants. So the next category of questions that I want to get into is about in-game strategy and regrets. And so there's a point about, did he wait too long to remove Camilo Doval from the closer's role? Like, I personally think he did. I was talking about it for about a month before they finally did it. I thought there were numerous times, like right before the All-Star break was a time I think Doval like imploded like in a game right before the All-Star break and had to be replaced by Walker or something to finish an inning, and they still ended up winning the game, I think. But then coming out of the All-Star break, it was still Doval, and then there was still more trouble. And then I think the front office made a decision optioning him. And then it put them in a position where they had that situation where their bullpen was a little too thin, and you had a game like where you felt like they had to win and they didn't have Doval, and you'd rather have Doval than like whoever is 8th best in your bullpen without Doval, you know? So I didn't like that. But the question from Baggarly that stands out here is there something that stands out as a decision or a strategy or a course that the team took this season that you wish you could take back? And he said, maybe pinch hitting a little too much. I'm going to pause right there. He continues, but pinch hitting a little too much. And that's interesting and stands out because they definitely, I don't have the numbers to back it up, but just by watching, I think it's fairly obvious that they pinch hit a lot less this year than they did the last several under Gabe Kapler. And so it is interesting that he says maybe pinch hitting a little bit too much this year was something he wishes he could take back. So he says maybe pinch hitting a little too much instead of staying a little bit more faithful in some of the guys. Like you look at Conforto's numbers against lefties. Now there are certain matchups that are just hard on lefties, period. But there are times that I pinch hit for him and I went back and thought, man, he's got a 900 OPS against lefties. Why did I do that? I need to show more faith in guys like that. And I sometimes have a tough time finding a balance about, did I leave a starter out there too long? Or did I go to the bullpen too early? And I think there's been a little bit of that this year. I feel like there's a little bit of that all the time. I guess if you're winning, you don't dwell on it as much. But certainly, I mean, in Conforto's case, I was aware of this because I know some of you on Twitter have been actively discussing, Michael Conforto and the fact that he's basically hit lefties well this season. The thing about platoon splits when we're talking about lefties and righties is that they kind of fluctuate from year to year. So you might in a given year hit well against lefties. Mike Yastrzemski is a great example. In 2020, the short season, I think he just crushed lefties. But then overall, in the course of his career, he's been significantly better against righties than lefties. And so you basically are supposed to assume normal platoon splits until proven otherwise over a large sample. So you're not living and dying year to year in single season platoon splits because you'd go crazy and it doesn't make sense because if you look at it, this year Michael Conforto has a 160 weighted runs created plus against lefties. He's hit 301, 376 on base, 554 slugging, 931 OPS. Like Melvin said, he does have did he say 900 OPS? Yeah, 931 is the actual number. Isolated power, 253. I mean, these are monster numbers that Conforto put up this season against lefties. But then you look at last year, he hit 219 in 102 plate appearances, and this year he's got 93 plate appearances against lefties. Last year he only walked 2.9% of the time against lefties. This year it's at like 11%. 265 on base last year versus 376 this year. 333 slugging last year versus 554 this year. 64 weighted runs created plus last year versus 160 this year. So, I just think you can't really live in. It's hard, though. Like, when you're a manager and you're seeing that, it's like, well, do I trust what I've seen this year? Or do I trust the body of work overall? Because if we look at the course of Michael Conforto's career, he's got a 97 weighted runs created plus against lefties. So he's been roughly a league average hitter when there's been a lefty on the mound versus when there's been a righty on the mound. He's been about 27% above average. So, like, looking at that, it makes sense to pinch hit for him in certain situations. But this season, for whatever reason, he did better against lefties than he did against righties. So I tend to think that, that's like the analytics decision is I'm pinch hitting for him because even though this season he's doing better against lefties, it's kind of random. And we should expect generally that, just because you did well in like 90 something plate appearances this year, the bigger body of work is more indicative. And you could say, well, we're going way too far in the past. And I might agree with that and say, okay, let's look at the last 3 years and see what it looks like. And that's why I pointed out what last year's numbers looked like. So was there a dramatic change that he made in his approach against lefties? Probably not. it's probably just one of those things that happens. It's just baseball, and weird stuff happens when the sample is relatively small. And 90 plate appearances, 100 plate appearances is a small sample, especially with things like platoon splits. And so I get where Melvin is coming from with this, and I get the struggle, and I get having regrets. Like when the season doesn't go well for you and you had higher expectations and you did things like pinch hit for a guy who really hit well against lefties over the course of the year, I can see why you would question yourself. And then there was also the question of Doval. And he said in regards to that, in our case here, was I too late to make a change in the closer role? What makes it so hard is because at the time you always feel like you're making the right move. You try to make every decision you make a good decision. They're not all going to be right, but the ones that stand out are when the bullpen gives up a lead, sure, and those are the ones you have to wear the hardest. So he also addressed another question about Doval that was I had it and I think I may have lost it. But the point was that he had a lot of faith in Doval and that it was the body of work, the track record. And that's the same thing we're talking about with Conforto. It's like the same thing in reverse, right? He didn't trust Conforto against lefties, even though he was showing that he was hitting lefties this year, because the overall body of work says he's not as good against lefties as he is against righties. Whereas with Doval, it's like, I'm not trusting the performance I'm seeing this year because the overall body of work has been significantly better than that. And at any given moment, he should be Camilo Doval and be able to get through it. But he said he regretted, and he thinks he waited about maybe a month too long. And that's exactly what I'm saying, is that he waited about a month too long with Doval. But I don't know. I don't think that was the difference between them making the playoffs and not. That's what I'm saying. This season, I don't think ultimately falls on Melvin. And I appreciate the tough kind of self-reflection and also putting a lot of the onus on himself and taking a lot of the blame for this season. I appreciate that. Gabe Kapler's end of season interviews, which Baggarly did as well every year, were frankly weird. And I think this one comes across as better and more human. And I don't think Melvin's going anywhere personally. So anyway, coming up in just a minute, looking towards the future. Melvin addresses the future of himself and the organization and the players and all that. So we'll get into it in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode of Locked on Giants is brought to you in part by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. And we talked about the 49ers odds going into yesterday, and that was obviously, the 49ers came out on top. They were favored. I think the point spread was like plus 4.5. That was before the news of Christian McCaffrey being out for the game came out. But even at those odds, you would have hit on that one as the 49ers won in a blowout. So congratulations to the 49ers. And this football season, you can check out all the action on FanDuel and for the rest of the baseball season and into the MLB postseason as well. So again, just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, here we go. We're going to get into the end of this interview with Bob Melvin, the last kind of topic, which is looking towards the future. There is some contingency of fans who wants Melvin to be fired. There's certainly a group that thinks Farhan Zaidi's time in San Francisco should be over. I understand those sentiments. I really do. This is year 6 of Farhan Zaidi. And to me, the years that I focus on are 4 through 6, 4, 5, and 6, like the last 3 years. Because if you had asked me when he was hired, when I was asked a lot, and we could go back and check the tapes, like when should we expect the, turnaround for this team, I probably would have said, and I'm pretty sure I did say, like maybe year 3, but definitely by year 4, year 5. And at that point, I think it was just a 5-year contract. And so we didn't even look too far past that, but years 4 and 5 for sure. So now we're talking 4, 5, and 6. You've got a 81 and 81 record in year 4, below 500 by a few games in year 5, and now you're looking at 2 games under 500 with like 18 to play in year 6. And so anyway, that's definitely something to look out for. And when changes are made, they're often made in like mid to late September. So I don't know what they're gonna do, but it's worth keeping an eye on. So in terms of team building and future outlook, Andrew Baggarly asked, how much can the Matt Chapman extension help cement the culture that you want to create here? And Melvin said, in concert with the younger players from the system, you need core veteran guys who are stabilizing forces and leaders. And Logan Webb and Matt Chapman are 2 huge pieces for us going forward. And by the way, Chapman's deal is for 6 more seasons. Logan Webb has 4 more seasons under which he is signed. And of course, you could extend him on top of that too at some point. But you're getting at least 4 more seasons of Webb and Chapman, just like your anchor in the rotation and anchor in the lineup and on the field in Chapman. So it's a pretty decent start with those 2. And he says with them and with the younger guys, we're not far away. As horrible as this feels right now, and I feel it every night, and especially now since I don't want to say it's a spiral, but we're playing probably our worst baseball right now, you have to step back and see the future. These types of moves really encourage and inspire you inspire you to look at next year and say, you know what, we're not many pieces off and we're not that far away. We can be really good as quickly as next year, in my opinion. And I agree. I do agree. I think they underperformed this year. I don't blame it on Melvin. It's hard for me, really. I mean, situational hitting 100% was bad and cost them this year. And also the pitching was just not as good as it could have been and should have been. And their, runs allowed was just too much, too high. And they were just really bad in clutch situations. And even with that, they kind of put up average-ish offensive numbers. And so they could have been much better than that if they had been better in clutch situations. And that's one of those stats where it doesn't translate from year to year. It's not like, it's just a collection of unclutch players. You could look at next year and the Giants could be number 1. The Padres this year are number 1, and they were horrible last year. And I don't think it's a common thread of Bob Melvin. Bob Melvin doesn't make you a clutch hitter. Like, it's just not how it works. So, lastly, the last couple of questions. Baggarly says, what does this team need that it does not currently have? Very straightforward. And Melvin says, we're starting to see it a little bit more athleticism, especially at home. We have to play really good defense and not beat ourselves. We have to create different ways to score, whether it's bunting a guy over, whether it's a hit and run, whether it's stealing some bases, whether it's creating some havoc, especially in our place. In low-scoring games, just don't beat yourself and find a way to scratch a run late, have a good bullpen that can shut it down. Going forward, I think that's what we need. And then Baggarly said, in terms of personnel, positional needs, roster construction. And Melvin said, I wouldn't want to get specific because I wouldn't want to say anything that might sound like an indictment of who's here, but I have real opinions about that. And so I would really like to hear what those opinions are, but he's not going to give them. And it makes sense. And I appreciate that about him. is that if he speaks on that, it is an indictment about who's there. If he's like, yeah, we need more, right-handed power at first base, or like just more production out of the corner infield, which would be an indictment of first base, like as an example, or we need better defense at second base, and that would be up the middle defense or something, and then it'd be like, okay, well, that's an indictment of Marco Luciano and his recent. I'm not talking about the pop-up. I'm talking more about all the other plays that have been a struggle for Marco Luciano defensively, whatever it would be that he would say. I'm interested to hear what his thoughts are. And I also just personally believe that, a lot of fans don't like the term financial flexibility, but what it really just means is the ability to spend on players. Like, you're not kind of hamstrung by a bunch of contracts that don't allow you to spend money. And the Giants consistently, like, one thing, a huge kind of credit in a way, I guess, to Farhan Zaidi is that they're not in that position. They're not stuck with a bunch of bad contracts. They don't really have any, like, really holding them back type bad contracts at all. Some people point to, like, oh, Taylor Rogers is going to make $12 million next year. Yeah, not ideal, but it's also, you're not being held, and that's the end of the deal after that. So the longer term deals, Robbie Ray can opt out of $50 more million, and then you locked up $50 million over 2 years, by the way, for Robbie Ray, and he'll probably not opt out given that he's not pitched enough, and you're turning down $50 million to hit an uncertain market, but we'll see. Matt Chapman locked up through 2030. Jung-Hoo Lee can opt out after 2027, so that would be 3 more years, but is signed for 5 more years if he doesn't opt out. Logan Webb signed through 2028, and Jordan Hicks signed through 2027. And other than that, nobody's guaranteed a role beyond 2025. So that's it for 2026 and beyond in terms of guarantees. Now, they have all these players they have the option to bring back, and that's the flexibility with Doval and Bailey and Walker and Harrison and Ramos and Fitzgerald and Yaz and Wade are entering, and Tyler Rogers, their last year of arbitration eligibility. So anyway, they're in a flexible position, and getting rid of Jorge Soler's contract was, in my opinion, a good thing because you could reallocate that money now in the offseason. They've got a lot of money they can spend in the offseason, and they've got some pieces. People thought of them as a playoff contender this year. It just didn't materialize as we hoped, but can kind of reset and try again this offseason, and they're pretty active every offseason. So they can just try again. No matter who's the person trying, they're in a position where they've got the money to spend, and they can spend it, and we'll see what happens. So anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. For your second listen, go check out the Locked On MLB podcast. Prepare for the Fall Classic with Sully, who has it all covered every single day. You can find the link to Locked On MLB in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out a lot, so thank you in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.